Counsel?
Thank you. All right, Dr. Esplin, there's one other little detail I want to clear up before we go on to the more substantive part of your testimony. Do you charge for your services?
Yes, I do.
All right, and what do you charge for the services in a case like this?
My standard rate is $400 per hour for the time I spend in my office. $3,600 per day, plus expenses, if I have to leave Arizona.
All right, and are you charging the defense in this case those amounts?
Yes, I am.
Now, I'd like to ask you, first of all, if you were asked to see any patients or do any clinical evaluations of anybody involved in this case.
No, I was not.
Were you sent a transcript of the testimony of Dr. Anthony Urquiza?
Yes, I was.
Other than that, were you sent any other information?
No, I was not.
Now, I'd like to ask you if you had an opportunity in the course of your studies and your practice over the years to hear the term, child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome.
Yes, I have.
And are you familiar with the person who developed that work on that syndrome?
Yes.
And who was that?
Roland Summit.
Was he a doctor?
Dr. Summit was an adult psychiatrist that worked in the Los Angeles area at I believe it's Harbor View, consulted with Los Angeles County relative to maltreatment issues.
All right, and what was the primary thrust of his work with people who are allegedly mistreated?
I believe that that the experiences that underlie the paper, the 1983 paper where he discussed the syndrome, were female patients who had been subjected to chronic incest or that they were individuals who had been sexually abused over an extended period of time by the father. And so it was not brief encounters. It was not encounters of short duration. It was encounters in which there was other facets to the relationship that was very important.
All right, now, you mentioned 1983, a paper written by Dr. Summit. Is that where he basically came up with the phrase, child abuse accommodation syndrome, or child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, that was the first paper. That's what people attribute to when he wrote that initial position.
All right, and in Dr. Urquiza's testimony, he actually referred to Dr. Summit, is that correct?
Yes.
All right, now, to further understand what you just said, Dr. Summit's work was based primarily on adult females who were reporting incest by their fathers, is that right?
It's my understanding as of the time that he wrote that initial paper.
Now, did he develop this child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome as a diagnostic tool, or what?
No, as I understand it, it was written to assist professionals and other people, other general population, in understanding the dynamics in which a child who has been subjected to a sexualized relationship goes about making the best of it.
All right.
So to help therapists trying to understand that there's dynamics there that are complex.
So a female child who is sexually molested by her father from a young age and was in later life dealing with this, is that the sort of situation that would be core to what Dr. Summit was dealing with?
I think the essence of it was, number 1, the chronicity, and number 2, the complexity of the relationship that existed independent of the sexual aspect.
All right.
If you have a child and they're in a family system, and the father is sexually exploiting the child, that's a complex circumstance for the child to react to. The child may love the father dearly, the child may recognize the importance of the father to the family's survival economically, and so the child is presented with a dilemma, and oftentimes the dilemma is they don't want this aspect of the relationship to continue. They don't want to have a sexual relationship with their father, but at the same time, they may love him dearly, and they may not want the family system to come apart, so they're put in a difficult spot. And oftentimes they, in fact, in those circumstances, more often than not, I think they try to accommodate it.
All right.
So make the best of it, and, until something happens where it comes out or they get older and separate from the family.
All right, and so when you say, accommodate, that's one of the words in the title that he gave to this. Are there validation studies? Let me ask you first. What are validation studies in general in a way that would apply to this sort of thing?
I think it's important to distinguish between a circumstance where we know abuse occurred and how does the person that's in this situation make the best of it, and looking at how we make a determination about whether abuse has or has not occurred. So the accommodation syndrome is best suited for helping us to understand how a known victim accommodates that victimization. That's separate from the utility of the syndrome in trying to determine whether an event occurred or did not occur. Then it has less utility. It wasn't intended for that purpose, and it can lead to mistakes.
So let me just stop you. Break this up a little bit. So when you're saying CSAAS, Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome, may lead to mistakes when you're trying to use it to predict whether or not somebody's telling the truth, is that what you're saying?
When you're trying to decide whether an event's occurred or not occurred, it has very limited value.
Okay.
Now, it has value. For example, one of the factors, the delay in reporting, that factor does have substantial scientific support, meaning that there are a lot of reasons why children that are in the circumstances don't tell anybody else for some substantial period of time. Now, but having said that, the timing of the outcry is not related to the validity of the allegation. So a person can come forward immediately. Maybe that's true, maybe it is not. A person can make the allegation after a period of delay. Maybe it's true, maybe it is not. So that it's a mistake if you use the timing of when the person first tells somebody else as suggesting that means it's more likely that it happened or did not happen.
Okay. In other words, there are certain things that are predictors and there are other things that are not necessarily predictors. Is that correct?
That's correct. And the other problem is, the absence of any of those factors would not suggest that the child had not been victimized.
Alright, so let's take delay. First of all, one of the factors in Roland Summit's original work. What you're saying is, delay. I'm sorry, let me withdraw that. What you're saying is actual abuse, sexual abuse, could end up resulting in a delay in reporting or not. Is that correct?
Correct.
And whether there's a delay or there's not a delay, that doesn't, in and of itself, help you to predict whether or not the person is telling the truth about the sexual misconduct. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Alright, and other than delay, have the other factors been subject to validation studies using control groups and scientific method?
No.
So, what are some of the other factors that are often quoted following Dr. Summit's original work?
They talk about secrecy, so that there will be a process in which the child is engaged. And in a lot of these cases, these are crimes of intent, not of impulse. So the person wants to lessen the probability of the child reporting, so there's some process in which they will convince the child, either directly or subtly, that it's something you have to keep to yourself. So that was the first phase, which was called secrecy. The second was called helplessness, and that related to a circumstance in which the child's not equipped, because of the power imbalance, to respond to the overtures in the way they might if it was an age mate, so that there's a sense of helplessness in that regard that they're more dependent. They're less capable of standing up for themselves. The third stage had to do with the process of accommodation, making the best of it, living with it. The fourth stage had to do with disclosure, or unconvincing disclosures, incomplete disclosures. And the fifth had to do with recantation, taking back. So those 5 factors are looked at as constituting the syndrome.
Have there been validation studies to validate any of those 5 factors?
The only one that has received validation is the delay in reporting. There are cases that occur in which the acts are acts of impulse. They're not acts of deliberation. A person gets intoxicated, he's a stepfather, the child is there, and he acts out those impulses. There are cases where there is an engagement process, a seduction process that does involve secrecies. But the difficulty is the concept. It's a heterogeneous group of kids that get maltreated, so the secrecy hasn't been borne out as in substantiated cases. That doesn't mean that there are occasions in which some process is undertaken by a perpetrator to lessen the likelihood the child's going to tell somebody, but it's just that it hasn't stood out and been validated.
So in the research, this has not been validated, is that correct?
That's correct.
And therefore, the presence or the absence of any or all of these elements that you've just got through talking about wouldn't really have any diagnostic utility. Is that correct?
None of the 5 factors have been subjected to ground truth studies in which you have 3 groups. You have one group of children which have indisputable evidence that the abuse occurred. You have a second group of children in which there's no abuse. And you have a third group of children of false allegations.
Alright.
And then you see to what degree do those concepts assist you in identifying accurately which group the child should be in. And there has not been that type of validation study.
So in your training of law enforcement and your multi-year process working with various law enforcement agencies both internationally and throughout the country, have you taken the position that their procedures should not rely on these particular factors for diagnostic purposes?
Yes, with the caveat that they need to be aware that there are circumstances that could involve one or more of these. But the absence wouldn't mean it didn't, and they don't want to think that, for example, that a delay suggests that it's not accurate. so that you need to inform them so they don't have beliefs that are incorrect.
Alright, so it doesn't act as a predictor. It's just information?
That's correct.
Alright, now, with regard to contradictory reports, is there a difference when you're dealing with small children who might be, 3 or 4 years old or 5 years old, and children in other age groups?
Yes.
Alright, can you tell us about children who would be in the 10 to 14 year age group, what you look for in reports?
If you examine the studies that's relating to the age effects on memory, and you look at the different effects, and you look at, say, 3 to 6 year olds, 6 to 9, 10 and up, what the developmental literature suggests is that by age 10 years, kids 10 and up, have roughly the equivalent qualities of memory as it relates to reporting events, what happened. They're less sophisticated when interpreting the meaning of what happened. As you move below 10, then you begin to see age effects in the amount of information reported, the different categories of details that they report. You see differences in what is meaningful to them versus older aged children, important. So it's important to know that with regard to event memory, what happened, where they were, other things that were occurring preceding the event and after the event, what's called contextual embedding, children are quite capable, from 10 up, to report that and to remember that quite well.
So in the 10 to 14 area, let us take that as an age group, would it be correct to say that incomplete reports would be fairly common, but contradictions of key details would not be expected?
That's what the literature would suggest. What that means is that it would not be uncommon, whether it is an adult or a child, if they've had a complex relationship in which sexual encounters have occurred on a frequent basis, to not give you all the information at one setting. The key is, as you look at what they say across time, is on what kind of details are they being consistent, and on what kind of details may there be omissions or additions upon each telling. The core elements, the central features of the event should remain steadfast.
Now, again, you were talking about over time where you have the chronic abuse that may go over a period of years. Is that the sort of situation you're talking about?
Yes.
If you have a situation that occurred involving a number of days at the most, within recent memory, would you expect children in the area of 10 to 14 to not only have key details right, but also to be fairly consistent in their report?
Yes.
Okay, now, I'm going to ask you about.
Now, I'm sorry, let me just add something.
Sure.
That assumes that they are motivated to disclose to you.
Alright.
It assumes you have a motivated child. It assumes that the events had distinctiveness or they were important to the person, and that they were alert at the time the events were occurring.
Alright, now, Dr. Urquiza offered some anecdotal testimony about the rate of false claims.
Yes.
Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
And do you think it's appropriate in your scientific background and your experience in working with this area to measure false claims rates using anecdotal experiences?
I think that you could fit that into the scheme, but that would not be wise to rely on that.
Alright, and if somebody only had interaction, with children who had been adjudicated to have been abused, and that was their experience for evaluating whether or not false claims occur, would that be an adequate experience base to make such an accurate determination?
Well, I think you'd need to point out that your sample were children that had previously been adjudicated, so that the rate of false alarms in that population you would expect to be less than if you were looking at children on the front end, where there was an ongoing investigation.
Alright.
Because there's an investigation, there's been an evidentiary hearing, there's been a sorting out of the evidence, so that the likelihood that you have a false alarm in that population would be less. It wouldn't be non-existent, but it would be expected to be substantially less than if you were looking at substantiation of the first reports. Those are much higher in unsubstantiated cases.
Alright, now, there have been studies to determine a range of false claims, a range of percentage of false claims, is that correct?
Well, let me just respond this way. To begin with, the base rate of true cases and false cases is not static. It's not the same. You might have different rates in 1985 than you have in 1995. You might have different rates of false alarms in 2000 than you had in 1995. Because as you're increasing public awareness, as you were doing programs with children to encourage reporting, those affect your base rates. So you can't, that's one problem. The second problem is the estimation of the base rates varies depending upon what criteria you've used to substantiate a case as being true or false, and so that makes it complex. I think the important thing is to be concerned not about the magnitude of the problem, but acknowledging that there are false cases of sex abuse. There are true cases of sex abuse, and there are false denials of sex abuse. And there are true denials. That's a fact. And then we could to try to argue about its frequency or infrequency is counterproductive scientifically.
Well, without arguing about it, let me ask you, have there been studies that have shown a false report rate somewhere between the 15 to 40% range?
Yes, I think if you looked at the survey studies, you'd see the estimates ranging from 2% to over 40%.
On the one hand, the 2%, do you believe that that's an accurate overall number?
That there are 2% of false allegation cases?
Right.
I do not agree with that. In 1992, there were 500,000 reports of sex abuse. There were, in the United States, there were 128,000 that they determined were substantiated or indicated. Now, they could be making mistakes both ways, but if you use that data, you would have a false alarm rate or a non-substantiated rate of over 50%. So you have to be very careful, when you talk about some absolute rate.
Who conducted that study, by the way?
The Center for Child Abuse, Neglect, National Center for Child Abuse and Neglect. It was based on 1992 U.S. Department of Health and Human Services data on reports.
Okay, would it be correct to say, do you feel, the actual rate of false reports is somewhere between that on the high side and 2% on the low side?
Well, I think that's way. Here's my problem. I think that you have to look at the context in which you're trying to evaluate the report. So you have a different rate of false alarms when you're looking at a divided family issue. So someone going through a divorce, that rate would be higher than the general population rate. The rate of false alarms would be lower when a child is left to their own devices than it would be if the child was subjected to external influences by someone in a position of authority. So you can't just take a rate out here as an absolute rate. You have to look at what are the contexts in which those classes of cases occur.
All right, let's talk about the person in position of authority. Would that include a mother?
Could well include a mother.
Now, there are different types of false claims, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you describe the types of false claims?
One type, which is more often seen with the 3 to 6-year-olds than the older-aged kids, is a circumstance where the child has a genuine but mistaken belief. So the child believes what it is they're telling you, they're just incorrect. That's one type of false belief.
Go ahead.
Another type of false belief is an older child who is reporting a belief that something happened in the distant past. So a 12-year-old is telling you about an event that happened when they were 3. The 12-year-old may believe that, but they could be incorrect. So that's the second type. You have a type where if the event under investigation is vague, so that the actions are not distinct and complex, that can be subject to confusion. So a witness could have a genuine belief, but because of the simplicity or vagueness of the event, that belief could be mistaken. The other category is where the child is being deceptive, either by omission or commission, meaning the child is saying this did not happen, when, in fact, it did, as being deceptive by omission, not telling you. Commission would be telling you something that they know is not correct.
Now, let me ask you about that last category. Would that be an intentional false claim?
Yes.
All right, and do intentional false claims occur most often in a particular age group?
10 and up.
Now, is this still relatively rare if the child is left to his or her own devices?
Yes, in the absence of external influences, the base rate with which a child, on their own, would come up with a false allegation would be significantly lower than it would be in the absence, or in the presence of external influences.
So in a situation where a parent was pushing the child to make a false claim for gain, would that be a circumstance under which an intentional false claim might be found?
Yes.
Now, is there any other factors that would affect that, such as the general truthfulness of the parent or the person who is in a position of authority?
I don't believe scientifically we've figured out yet how to separate valid from invalid accounts based upon what a child or adolescent may tell you alone, without considering other types of evidence. We haven't been able to figure that out. Having said that, the other concern is that there's a point where children come to know the power of certain statements or information. So there is circumstances where they can understand that and use that for manipulation. You would want to look at the environment, the world of that child. You'd want to look at what are the ethical standards of the caretakers, what is their customs, what's their belief about the importance of forthrightness, or, in the alternative, lack of forthrightness. The primary influence on forthrightness or integrity comes from children watching how their parents conduct themselves. So if you want your child to have a good work ethic, you have one. If you want your child to be forthright, you try to be forthright. So it has a powerful influence. You'd want to look carefully at the environment of the child.
So that environment would include whether or not the parents or parent that is in the child's environment is a truthful and forthright person. Is that correct?
Whether or not they have a character of being accurate and candid and forthright about important matters.
And basically, if they don't have that character, if they aren't forthright about important matters on a regular basis, that could increase the chance that a child, age 10 or older, could engage in intentional false claims?
Well, it lessens the child's appreciation for forthrightness. It provides them an opportunity to model behavior where you may decide not to tell the truth because it suits your purposes. So it would increase the likelihood that a child may adopt that type of pattern in their relationships.
Now, is it possible that false claims can occur in situations where there is a motive on the part of the influential adult?
Yes, it's very important to look at the context of the original outcry, look at the key players, and look to see whether there exists any stake in the outcome or any potential gain by people who are significant in the child's world. You'd want to rule that out as a matter of investigative course.
And would financial gain be a potential motive on the part of the influential adult?
Could be.
And a desire to seek retribution against somebody on the part of the influential adult?
Could be.
Would that also be a motive?
Revenge.
Okay, thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
Doctor, you mentioned a good afternoon. Excuse me.
Hi.
Doctor, you mentioned that there was, am I on? Okay. You mentioned there was a study that you had reviewed that talked about 500,000 different accusations in a period of time and only so many substantiated. Do you have that study with you?
I don't have the study. I have the citation.
You didn't bring the study with you?
No.
Would you tell us the citation on that, please?
Yeah, it was published by the National Center for Child Abuse and Neglect, 1994. It covered the reporting period of 1992. The data came from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services statistics on child maltreatment. So there was physical abuse, emotional abuse and sex abuse, reported incidents in that data.
We're not talking about exclusively sexual abuse, then?
No, I think there were 202.8 million cases reported. Of that 2.8 million, 500,000 were sexual maltreatment.
And when you talk about validated or substantiated, what do you mean?
They were simply whoever did an investigation. The investigative agency classified them as indicated or substantiated, or not indicated or not substantiated.
If a child makes an allegation of sexual abuse and then recants it, would that be indicated, substantiated or otherwise?
I don't know whether they would substantiate it and then remove it. I have a problem with the concepts, substantiate, and indicated, because I think there's errors on both using that concept. It's a concept that was developed out of protective services, which is reason to believe, but there's a lot of errors both ways when you look at what criteria they're using for, quote, indicated, or, quote, substantiated.
It's hard to make sense of such a figure if we don't know what exactly it is they do to substantiate an accusation, right?
That's correct.
Would it be fair to say that the substantiation of those accusations would be different depending on whether they're sexual abuse, physical abuse or emotional abuse?
Yes, I would put very little stake in that data, because it didn't define ground truth sufficiently. I would not put any data on saying, well, that means there's 128,000 true cases, and the balance false. I think that would be incorrect. So how I use it was to show the extremes of the estimates.
Okay.
And the limitations of the estimates.
You view the 2% rate to be a little bit silly?
Yes.
And you view the 50% rate to be a little bit silly?
I would view it that way, yes.
It's somewhere in there, but nobody knows quite where, is that right?
Again, left to their own devices, I would say with children below 13 it would be a lot less.
And you mean false accusations?
Yes.
Do you believe that there are fewer false accusations the younger the child goes?
6 to 10. Left to their own devices, I think the rate of false alarms, where that child would come up with it on their own, would be very low, compared to the 13+ group or the 3 to 6 group. With the 3 to 6 group, I don't believe the majority are intentionally lying. I think they may have mistaken beliefs due to concerns of suspicions on the part of people that have influence on them.
Alright, Doctor, in terms of disclosures, you agree with Dr. Urquiza that you really can't draw any conclusion from a child reporting late, is that right?
Yes.
We're talking about reporting allegations of sexual abuse?
Correct.
And is it a true statement that most children never report?
Well, if they never report it, we wouldn't know they were abused. So I think that the more accurate statement would be there are a number of people that wait an awfully long time to come forward. They may not come forward during their minority. If they never come forward, we wouldn't know whether they were abused or not.
But are there figures that speak in terms of the numbers or percentages of occasions that victims of childhood sexual abuse report, either during their adolescence, during their teen years, during their young adult years, or at any time during their adult years?
Yes.
And are those figures such that you're able to say that there are substantially large numbers of people who never report, ever?
I think it would allow you to estimate there would be a sizable number that do not share that with another person.
I mean, we can't conclude that the number of people who ultimately do report stand for the entire population of those who have ever been abused. Is that correct?
No, that's right. And I agree. I think we agree. Given the fact that a sizable do not report as children but report later in life, would allow you to assume there's also a sizable number that haven't reported yet.
And you would agree with Dr. Urquiza when he says that the time and even the manner in which one discloses is not necessarily reflective of the truth of the allegation.
Yes.
And in fact, children often report in piecemeal. They'll give a little information now, and a little information later, and more information after that. Would that be true? That's not unusual?
I would agree with that if, by that, you're talking about that they don't tell you everything there is to tell you on the initial disclosure. I would agree with that.
And that kids don't necessarily know what's important to tell or not to tell.
I'm going to object. It's vague, because, as to the age of the kids.
Overruled. Go ahead.
I think what they would view as important would not be the same as what we may view as important.
And that's the distinction that you made when you told us that children from about 10 on have memories that are fairly comparable to adults.
Event memories.
Event memories, yes. But they don't necessarily know what's important to say.
That's correct. They're less capable of giving meaning to the event as it's occurring.
All right.
And they're less capable of determining how important it may be to tell versus not tell. And they become indecisive, so they don't take any action because they're, when I talked about their capacities, it was for event memory, not understanding and developing a strategy for their own best interest.
And, doctor, sometimes it's dependent upon age and gender of the child in terms of the likelihood that they would be disclosing at all. Would that be correct? Those are factors to weigh in consideration?
Yes.
All right. And if you're talking about a male adolescent child and a male offender, that could be very difficult for a child to reveal that kind of abuse. Is that correct?
Do you mean a male offender or a male offender, male victim?
Male offender, male victim, male adolescent victim.
Yes.
And by adolescent, we're talking about, age 10 to 13, 14, around there.
Yes.
And one of the reasons that that's particularly difficult is because of the stigma of being labeled homosexual. Would that be correct?
Yes.
And in fact, children from 10 to 14 really do appreciate the significance of that label, don't they?
I think they appreciate by third grade.
All right, so
you have a greater denial rate on validated cases with males than females.
All right. An adolescent child walking up to another boy in the school ground is not particularly inclined to tell that other boy or group of boys that they were molested by a man. Would that be true?
I would agree with that.
All right. Now, doctor, in assessing credibility of victims, one of the things you do is just look at what they say, right? See if it makes sense.
You would want to examine how the information was obtained and the different categories of details. To the statement.
You'd want to see if those interviews are tape recorded, would you not?
Yes.
Because that would tend to resolve a lot of questions about what exactly was said or not said to the child.
Help you do a systematic analysis of that interview.
And, doctor, when we're dealing with compliant victims particularly, you're looking to the extent of the relationship between the victim and the offender, is that right?
Yes.
All right. As opposed to a victim who simply comes upon an offender on the street and is forcibly abducted or forcibly molested. Those are different kinds of cases, are they not?
Yes.
And in dealing with compliant victims, there's usually a relationship that exists or occurs or is developed between the offender and the victim.
Yes. You're talking about outside of the sexual elements?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. And that relationship establishes or the activities that lead to that relationship are what allow this act to take place. Is that correct? The sexual act.
If the acts were intentional, purposeful, then it would be quite usual for there to be aspects to the development of the relationship, the development of other aspects to it, that would set the stage for the sexualization of it and potentially lessen the probability of disclosure.
Yes. Children around the age of 9 to 13 are really not inclined to engage in sexual activity with an adult unless they've been groomed for it. Would that be correct?
I'm going to object. That's beyond the scope of the direct.
Sustained.
I believe that what leads to these acts are exactly what was asked in direct. Certainly in the context of the activity and evaluating it.
I would object to speaking responses.
Sustained.
Doctor, would you expect that, in dealing with a compliant victim or a victim who knows the person and has some level of relationship, that if a child tells you that he was befriended by this person, that would certainly be consistent with establishing that kind of relationship, is that right?
Correct.
If the child tells you that he or she has spent a great deal of time with that person, perhaps an inordinate amount of time than one might expect an adult to be spending with a non-related child, that would be consistent with the establishment of that type of relationship, is that right?
Could be.
If a child tells you that he or she was given gifts or privileges beyond what an adult would normally give a child, that would be consistent with the establishment of this type of relationship, is that right?
I'm going to object. This is beyond the scope of direct.
Overruled.
Is that correct?
I would agree.
Alright, if the gifts are particularly personal in the sense of a gift of something that's literally taken off the person of the adult, a watch or jacket, and given to the child, that they may then put it on themselves, that's a particularly personal gift, that could be consistent with the development of that kind of relationship, is that right?
I'm going to object to the relevance. Could be consistent.
Overruled.
You can answer.
The greater the value of the gift to the recipient, to the child, the more persuasive the gift would have, the more persuasiveness.
Taking a child to fun places and occupying that child's time with fun events would be consistent with the development of that type of relationship, is that true?
It could.
Giving a child money would be consistent with that, would it not?
It could.
Having a child share intimate moments with the adult such as, staying in his room for long periods of time, would be consistent with it, would it not?
It could be.
Having a child share a bed with the adult would be consistent with the establishment and creation of that type of relationship, would it not?
Could be.
Getting a child's parents to trust the person, making efforts to really become close to the child's parent and even telling them that they have to trust the person would be consistent with that, would it not?
Could be.
I'm going to object. This is speculative and, at this point.
Overruled.
Allowing a child to do grown-up things, such as drinking or swearing, would be consistent with the establishment of the kind of relationship that would sexualize a child or reduce inhibitions. Would that be true?
It would develop a specialized relationship. Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, hugging a child, kissing a child, I don't mean in a sexual way, but just allowing a child to become comfortable with physical contact, so touching a child and kissing a child more frequently than what an adult would do with a non-related child, that could be consistent with the establishment of that kind of relationship, is that right?
It could.
Letting a child stay up late or even up all night long.
Again, if it was a special entitlement or a special privilege, that could relate to the process.
Undressing or being naked in front of a child is a way of sexualizing a child, is that right?
I'm going to object. That's beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
Showing a child sexually graphic material is a way of sexualizing a child, is that right?
Objection. Beyond the scope of direct.
Sustained.
Well, doctor, wouldn't you want to look at statements of children who talk about, or who complain of being victims of sexual abuse and who would fit into the category of the compliant victim? Wouldn't you want to see if, in fact, there is that kind of a relationship that had been established that would accommodate the commission of those kinds of acts on a child?
Yes, you'd want to look at that within the investigation, both with information you may have obtained from the child and other sources to see whether or not there was materials that were sexually toned.
Because it's exactly that type of behavior that allows a child to be party to those types of behaviors. Is that right?
Well, it would. It could serve to desensitize the child to sexually toned materials that could lead to more sexually toned acts.
And it's that type of behavior that would, to the greatest extent possible, guarantee that a child would not report those types of events. Is that true?
I object to that question. It's ambiguous and argumentative.
Overruled.
Is that true?
To the extent that the child comes to perceive they were a party to it and had a stake in it, it could lessen their motive to report.
Children don't always understand what is happening to them when they are being subjected to sexual behavior by an adult, do they?
No, but the point I was trying to make is if they come to think they've got some responsibility, so they've gone along, and if they're aware that that would not be sanctioned by, say, the parents, then if they then participated, they may have a motive to not disclose out of fear of consequences for themselves.
Is that unusual, that a child would have or experience some level of self-blame? That they would think that they're responsible for what happens?
No, that's not uncommon.
That's not uncommon. Okay.
When the participants are known to each other, it would be less common if it would be a stranger assault circumstance.
Doctor, is it your expectation that a child who has been molested would immediately report that molestation to that child's parent, mother or father?
No.
In fact, isn't it the case that the parents are often the last ones to know? That they don't want their parents to know?
Objection. Your Honor, it's argumentative.
Overruled. You may answer.
Okay, with 10 and up, I would say that with younger aged children, the more likely to go to parents. They may not know they've been abused, they may not appreciate the circumstances. I think the older aged kids are more likely to go to a friend, not the parents.
Are children concerned about not being believed?
Yes, if they.
Objection. That's ambiguous as phrased. Overbroad.
Sustained.
Are children concerned that they will not be believed if they disclose that they have been molested?
The older aged children, I would agree with that statement.
By older aged, are you referring to 10 and older?
8 and up for that question.
That's one of the issues that they deal with. Will I be believed? In terms of whether or not to come forward with this disclosure.
Correct.
And if the person who committed these acts, if that person is a respected person in the community, highly regarded person in the community, do children intuitively understand that that factors into the question of whether or not they'll be believed?
The older children, yes. The younger, the children below age, not as willing. Over 10, I think they can appreciate. They can weigh that possibility clearer than the 5-year-old can.
Are children concerned, even at age 8, with the stigma of sexual abuse?
Yes.
And does that factor into their decision as to when to disclose?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
Okay. As a scientist, you were asked a bunch of questions there that started out, could it be consistent with? Do you understand what those questions meant? In other words, consistent with.
Well, could you see it occurring in a particular case, not see it in another case?
In other words, if somebody says, is it consistent with somebody going into a 7-Eleven and committing an armed robbery in broad daylight? Is it consistent with that the person got up in the morning? The answer would be, yes, wouldn't it?
That's correct.
Consistent with, questions prove too much, don't they?
I'll object as argumentative.
Sustained.
Okay. What Mr. Zonen asked you about, taking people to fun places, does that mean if a person takes children to fun places that they are therefore molesters?
No, and that's why you have to be quite careful when you develop investigative leads which would come from patterns of conduct that might have that motive, but you don't want to base your determination about whether a crime's occurred based upon what might be consistent with. You could have a Boy Scout leader or a Little League coach that was a pedophile, a predatory pedophile, that was seeking opportunities to exploit those kids that were under their care. You could also have a wonderful human being that was trying to shape the personality development of those kids. And you have to be pretty careful, because there's things to take note of, but they don't constitute the kind of corroboration that allows you to have increased certainty about whether a sexually motivated act has occurred.
There are people who are just nice, caring, loving people who love children. Is that right?
That's correct.
And they're not molesters, right?
That's correct.
All right. Now, you indicated in response to some of the questions of the district attorney that children may make one kind of report or another kind of report. Again, the question is whether or not the actual event occurred. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, you were asked about some indicators. Let me ask you about some other indicators. You were asked about some specific things that I stayed away from, but I'm going to ask you now in response to the DA's questions. If a child who is in that age of 10 to 14 were to report that his grandmother told him that he had to masturbate, because boys get to a certain level, and if they
I'm going to object as exceeding the scope of direct examination, assuming facts not in evidence.
What's the direction here?
I'm going to ask if that statement has been made consistently, under oath and then in prior statements and then in court. The defendant is accused of making that statement. Is that consistent with children directly lying?
All right, I'll sustain the objection.
All right. When you look at the category of cases where there's a potential for intentional false statements, okay. Because I know you've told us about everything else, but let's just focus on intentional false statements by minors. Are the factors that you want to look at? Do they include whether or not a minor makes a directly contradictory statement about something that was said or done?
Yes.
And when you look at intentionally false claims cases, is it important to look to see whether or not the parents of that minor engaged in a long course of deceptive and lying behavior?
Yes.
And would it be important to look at whether or not the parents of that minor child actively engaged the minor child in supporting them in their deceptive behavior to people?
Yes, that would be particularly important.
Okay, thank you. No further questions.
But Mr. Sanger asked you about nice people who genuinely love children as being people that would tend to do the types of things that I read to you earlier. You would not include among that category nice people who genuinely love children, those who show children sexually explicit material, would you?
I would not.
Thank you. No further questions.
And I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you. You may step down.
May I be excused, Your Honor?
You're not excused. You may step down. You are to remain on call until the completion of this trial.
Okay.
Which is not very much longer.
Thank you, sir.
But he may go.
He certainly may go back to Arizona. He remains on call.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
The defense will call Mr. Julio Avila.
When you get to the witness stand, please remain standing. Face the clerk here and raise your right hand.
Yes.
Please be seated. State and spell your name for the record.
My name's Julio Avila. Julio, Julio. Avila, Avila.
Good afternoon, Mr. Avila.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Avila, where are you employed?
Neverland Ranch.
And how long have you been working there?
About 4 years and 6 months, 7 months.
What kind of work do you do there?
Right now I'm working as security.
And what other jobs have you had at Neverland?
I worked in the park.
What did you do?
I was a park operator.
Okay, is that the amusement park?
Yes.
What were you doing as an amusement park operator?
Maintenance, run the rides for guests, and run the small trains.
Any other jobs you've had at Neverland?
No, those are the only 2.
Those two?
Yes.
And currently you're in security?
Yes.
What do you do in the area of security?
I work in the night shift. On the night shift we just do our perimeter checks, walk around the property to make sure everything is good.
And do you know the fellow seated at counsel table to my right?
Yes.
Who is he?
That's Mr. Jackson, my boss.
Okay, do you recall ever meeting a family by the name of Arvizo?
Yes.
And when do you think you first met them?
I met them maybe a couple of months after I started working there. It was maybe like 5 months after they had, the blood drive.
And approximately when do you think that was? Do you know?
I'm guessing maybe like in December, January of 2000, I think. No, January 2001.
Now, you mentioned a blood drive. What blood drive are you talking about?
I think it was a blood drive that they had for Gavin.
Did you participate in that?
No, I started working maybe, 3 weeks after that.
Okay, so when you first met, let me rephrase that. Did you meet Janet Arvizo at some point?
Janet. I met her, but I hardly talked to her.
Did you ever meet Gavin Arvizo?
Yes.
And do you recall when you first met him?
It was like a regular guest. Comes to the park and wants to ride some rides.
Did you meet Star Arvizo?
Yes.
Where did you meet him?
In the park.
How about Devellin Arvizo?
Same. In the park.
Met her in the park, too. And that's the amusement park, right?
The amusement park, yes.
When you first met Gavin Arvizo, what was he doing?
When I first met him, I think he drove up on, one of the golf carts that the guests use, and just came up and he wanted to run some rides, so I run some rides.
Now, did he just come up to you and ask you to let him on the amusement rides?
Yeah, they'll come up and they just say, I want to get on the Ferris wheel. Okay, so I'll go over there and I run it for them.
If there aren't a lot of children at Neverland, can whoever is there just come up to you and ask you if you'll turn a ride on and let him do it?
If he could turn them on himself?
No, if you will.
Oh, yes.
Typically, if there aren't a lot of children on the rides, will a child come up to you and say, could you please start the Ferris wheel, or, could you please start the carousel, that kind of thing?
Yes.
And normally would you try and accommodate them?
Yes.
And what hours were you working when you were working in the amusement park?
Usually there's 2 shifts. Usually I would work the 7 o'clock to 3:30, and sometimes I would switch off from 1:30 to 10 o'clock. The park usually closes at 10 o'clock.
Okay.
The amusement park.
Okay, now, did you operate some rides for Gavin?
Yes.
Did you operate some of the rides for Star?
Yes.
How about Devellin?
Yes.
Okay, and what rides did you observe them to be on?
They were mostly on the big rides, which was the Zipper, the Spider, the Ferris wheel, Sea Dragon, the bumper cars, and the swings.
How many times do you think you accommodated Gavin when he wanted to get on an amusement park ride?
Wow, a lot. Numbers, 60, 70, 80. A lot of times.
And how many times do you think you accommodated Star Arvizo when he wanted to take a ride?
About the same.
And how many times do you think you accommodated Devellin Arvizo when she wanted to get on one of the rides?
About the same.
Alright, now, did you have a chance to observe the behavior of Gavin on those rides?
I'll object. Vague as to time.
I'll rephrase.
All right.
At any time did you have a chance to observe Gavin on those rides?
Not really in the beginning to observe him, because they were just regular guests that would come, and then they would just leave somewhere else after they were done with the rides.
But did you ever see them do anything that bothered you?
At first, no.
At any time?
After a while, their behavior would get more, how can I say it? Confident to do other stuff that we didn't approve of.
What didn't you approve of that they did?
Objection. Relevancy.
Overruled.
Like spit at myself and a coworker. Stuff like that. Like when they would be on the rides, they would, either spit at us when we were, on the wave swinger, when they would be all the way on the top, they would spit at us down, take off their shoes and throw it at us. Stuff like that.
Did you see Gavin do that often?
Yes.
Did you see Star do that often?
Yes.
Did you ever see Devellin do anything like that?
No. No.
You said they dropped things from the rides?
Yes.
What did they drop?
It was mostly when they would throw stuff. That would be their shoes. And they would spit and stuff like that.
Did you see them spit on you?
Yes.
Did you see them drop shoes on you?
Yes.
Now, what did you do? Excuse me, let me rephrase that. What was your response to Gavin and Star spitting on you?
I would just tell them to stop or I wouldn't run any rides for them.
And did they seem to respond to your statements?
Yes. When I would tell them to stop, they would.
And what was your response when they'd throw their shoes at you?
Same thing. I would tell them to stop, and they stopped.
Did you ever see them spit on anyone besides yourself?
Yes. My coworker.
Who was your coworker?
His name is Javier Velasco.
And did you ever see them throw shoes at anyone else?
On anyone else, no.
Was there any time of day that you would tend to operate the rides for Gavin and Star?
What was that again?
Was there any particular time of day when you tended to operate the rides for the Arvizo children?
Just whenever they would get there. Sometimes they would get there early. Then they'd leave. A couple hours later they would come back. So just whenever they would want to ride the amusement park, we would run the rides.
You mentioned one other employee, Mr. Velasco, right?
Yes.
To your knowledge, did any other employees complain about the Arvizo children's behavior in the amusement park?
Maybe the other coworkers that work in the park, they seen stuff like that. But the ones that interacted more with them was myself and Javier Velasco.
Did you ever see Gavin and Star operate one of the rides themselves?
Yes.
And describe what you're talking about, please.
I was running the zipper, which is at one side of the park, and then when I looked to the other side of the park, I noticed that the swing was running and I was the only one there. So I had to stop this ride and run over to the ride that was running and figure out what was going on, and I guess Star was turning on the rides by himself without any supervision of an employee.
So what did you do in response?
I just stopped it right away, and I told them, you can't be doing that, because it's, someone could get in an accident.
Did you actually see them begin to operate that ride?
No, but when I was getting there, he was sitting down in the control panel.
Where is the control panel in relation to the actual ride?
It's right in the middle of the ride. So the swings are going, and he's like in the middle. The control panel's right in front right here.
So was he sitting down in the control area?
He was sitting down, yes.
And operating the ride?
Yes.
Was anyone actually riding on the ride?
Yes.
While he operated it?
The sister was on the ride.
So Develin's on the ride, and Star is operating it at the control panel?
Yes.
Did you see Gavin anywhere at that point in time?
No, not at that moment.
Okay. Did you determine how long Star had been operating that ride on that occasion?
Maybe like 30 seconds before I got there.
And where did you have to come from to stop that behavior?
I was running the zipper, which is, let's see, about maybe like 60, 70 yards away.
Okay. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that. Is there a part of Neverland called the control room?
Control room, yes. That's a room that turns on all the lights, most of the lights for the amusement park.
And where is the control room located?
It is. As soon as you come in towards the park, it's by, like, a tree, castle kind of thing, like treehouse, and it's right under that.
And what does the control room look like?
There's some stereo equipment and then there's a lot of breaker boxes that turn on the lights.
Is the control room a big area?
No, it's maybe like from right here to like right there, something like that. It's kind of small.
And how do you get into the control room?
There's a door that, you open up a door and you just go right in.
Is the door ever locked?
When we're there it's open all the time. But when we leave, we lock it.
Okay, and how do you lock the door to the control room?
It's just a simple knob, hit the switch and close it.
Do you have a key?
Yes.
Okay, does anyone else work in the amusement area with you?
That has a key?
Yeah, does everybody have a key to that?
Yes.
Is that everybody who works in the amusement ride area?
It's amusement ride area and security has one key.
Now, when you're operating those rides, you say you leave the door open?
Yes.
Okay, are you generally far away from that control room door?
No, it's usually pretty close.
Okay, so you're not far away from it when you're doing your work in the amusement park, right?
Oh, no.
Okay, did you ever have a chance to find Star Arvizo in the control room?
Yes.
Please explain what you mean.
Well, I was using the telephone and, then Star or Gavin would just know where to find us sometimes. When they couldn't find us around the park, they would check the control room, if we were there.
Did you have a chance to watch Star's behavior in the control room?
Yes.
What did you see?
He was writing on the control room, like by where the phone's at, the words, "You suck dick."
You saw him write that?
Yes.
And what time of day was this?
Mid-afternoon.
And did you walk into the control room and see him doing this?
When I was using the phone, he was doing it. And when I turned around and saw, I asked him, like, what are you doing? You know, you can't be writing that kind of stuff here. And he kept on doing it. And when he was done, I just kind of like, with another pen, just kind of went over it, take out the words.
Did you say anything to him?
Yeah, I told him not to be writing that kind of stuff here.
Did he say anything back to you?
No, he just laughed.
Did he leave the control room after that?
Yeah.
Okay, was that the only time you ever saw him in the control room?
He would go some other times, like, 2, but he wouldn't write anything no more.
Okay, now, did you ever see Star with any adult magazine?
Yes.
Explain what you saw.
Like one time in the zipper, in the control panel, which is, the rides here. The control panel's right in front to run the ride. There was a magazine in there. And then Star came up and he saw it, he's like, oh, that's mine.
And did he tell you where he got the magazine?
Yeah, he said he brought it from home.
From his home?
Yes.
What did you see him do with that magazine?
He was just looking at it. And when he would, you know, walk away, he would just stash it like in the pant area, like tuck it in.
Did you ever see him put it anywhere to hide it?
Not put it, but I would find. I found it in the zipper and I think someone else from the park found one like where the swings are at.
Okay, and did they say anything to him, to your knowledge?
To my knowledge, no. I don't know.
Yes. Now, after he told you he brought it from his home.
Uh-huh.
What did he do with the magazine?
He was just looking at it. And then I'm like, well, you know what? Just put it away, because there's other guests here, and just don't be bringing it to the park.
And what part of the park did you find Star with the magazine he said he brought from his home?
Where the zipper's at, which is closer to like where the theater area is at.
Was Gavin with him at this point in time?
No, not at that point.
Was Devellin with him at this point in time?
I think she was.
And what were they doing when you caught Star with that magazine?
I think she was on the ride, the one I was running, while Star was looking at it.
Okay, now, which ride was she on, if you know?
The zipper.
Okay, so are you at the control panel?
Yes, I'm in the control panel.
You're operating the zipper for Devellin, right?
Yes.
And where is Star standing at that point?
The control panel's here, and then there's a fence area, just like small, right here, and he was right here on this side, to the right.
When you first saw his magazine, where did you see it?
It was the control panel. There's 2 doors that you open up, like 2 little black doors you open up, and it was tucked in there.
And did he admit it was his?
Yes, he did.
Did he then take it from that area?
Yeah, he took it away, and he started looking at it, and then when I told him to put it away, he just tucked it in his pants.
Now, was this sometime in the year 2003, do you think?
Yes.
Was it February or March of 2003, do you know?
You know what? I'm not sure exactly what month.
Okay, when you talked to Star about the adult magazine, was Devellin still on the ride?
Yes.
Had they arrived together, to your knowledge, for the ride?
I think she arrived first, and then she got on, and then, I think, because each one had different cars, I think. And when she got on, Star was right behind her.
Okay, now, you've described one incident where you caught Star trying to operate a ride.
Uh-huh.
With Devellin on the ride, right?
Yes.
Did you ever see any of the Arvizo children do that again?
Maybe before that, Gavin would try to start them, too.
And describe what you mean, please.
For example, let's say Gavin, Star and his sister would come up and they would be, can we ride the zipper? Sure. As we were walking, maybe Gavin was already at the control panel trying to start it.
And you saw this happen?
Yes.
What did you do when you saw that happen?
I told them, not to be doing that, because, only the employees can be running the rides.
Did you ever see Gavin or Star driving quads on the property?
Yes.
And please describe what a quad is.
That's a quad is like a 4-wheel, like a motorcycle where you can take to the mountains and drive them around the property.
How fast do they go?
How fast do they go? Maybe like 30 miles per hour, I guess. 40.
Did you observe them driving those quads?
Yes.
What did you notice about it?
Destructive. Run over the grass. Just almost. I mean, Gavin almost tried to, he almost ran over, my coworker, Javier Velasco. If he wasn't paying attention, he would have gotten hit, but he was aware of how they were driving, so.
And when you saw them driving like this, did you say anything?
No. We did at first, but after a while they would keep on doing it, and, we would just stay out of the way.
Did you see the mother around while they were driving the quads in this fashion?
I hardly saw the mother.
Did you ever see the mother at the amusement area?
Rarely. Maybe like once. Let's say if they were there for a week, maybe she would come down once for, a couple minutes and that's it.
No further questions, Your Honor.
All right, we'll take our break.